So that is our thought leadership piece that we bring out to inform our clients and partners of exactly what is going on in the media space and how they can take full advantage of that. So shifting into a little bit of what that entails, we want to start off with a pretty simple chart and a pretty simple concept, and that's the concept of cord cutting. So obviously video is evolving very, very quickly in this day and age, and cord cutting is not a new concept. It's obviously been kicked around for quite a few years now. But now that we have seen how it has played out, it's interesting to see exactly what the trade-offs are and how consumers are adapting and adjusting to the different video formats that do exist in the marketplace. So what you're looking at here, starting in 2016 on the left side of the chart all the way up to this current year, 2021, is the US household penetration of traditional pay TV. So that meaning satellite or cable. And you can see that year on year, we've seen about a 3% drop off in terms of that penetration in US households, onto the point where now in this year, about 66% of US households still have a traditional pay TV setup, which is interesting. And nothing to obviously overlook, 66% is still a very significant part of the market. And there are certain elements of pay TV that make it very attractive and sticky for the consumers. Certain genres of TV like live sports and live and local news are very firmly rooted in that place and have a very loyal following. And it's also just very familiar to all of us as consumers. It's what we were raised on for the most part. And so there's a very low barrier to entry and kind of ease of use that makes it still very familiar and easy for us to kind of tune into. But what's interesting is when we overlay what CTV has done in that same time period, we see that the penetration has really usurped pay TV in terms of just being present in households, onto the point where now in 2021, we're quickly approaching 80%. Some other research sources actually say that we're over 80%. And there's a lot of different factors that kind of play a role in terms of why CTV has found such an easy entry into the US household. A lot of it has to do with technology, and that the technology that we go out and upgrade our household tech stack with nowadays is oftentimes designed in such a way that it is ready for CTV to go day one. And our behaviors have also shifted significantly in such a way that we are very accustomed nowadays to connect all of our devices to the internet. It's not a really big ask nowadays. When we even walk into a restaurant, we're oftentimes looking for the Wi-Fi immediately. So this increased level of connectivity and technology options that are present for US consumers have really helped CTV jump into the forefront of the mindset very significantly. Now, while those trends were playing out and we saw that pay TV had dropped off significantly in terms of household penetration, and CTV seemingly has picked up some of that slack, one thing that we're noticing is that total amount of time that US consumers are spending with television is pretty consistent year on year off. So looking at this chart, we're looking at the total number of minutes or average number of minutes that US adults are spending watching TV year on year. And there's a bit of ebb and flow, obviously. What's interesting, obviously, was 2020 was fairly anomalistic in terms of how it had shifted our lifestyles and behaviors. And so we saw a pretty significant uptick in terms of total time spent with television. And it's yet to be seen exactly how 2021 and 2022 beyond will play out in its entirety. This data was pulled earlier in 2020, and we obviously didn't know what state we'd be in currently in terms of vaccination rollout and working from home and homeschooling, et cetera. So it's very possible that in the near future, we could even see these projections for 2021 and 2022 increase slightly more. So if pay TV is dropping and CTV is increasing and total time spent watching TV is fairly consistent, then obviously there are some behavior changes that are existing or starting to take form. And that's what we're showing you on this chart. So looking from left to right is the first quarter of the last 3 years and the total amount of time that consumers were spending with video across various types of devices. So that blue segment of each of the bars is your live and time shifted TV, which is still very significant, but quickly eroding away as other formats like CTV and smartphone and personal computer are all starting to share the pie of time spent with video. But what's interesting to note is that orange slice, the connected TV devices, are obviously picking up the most of the slack as people move away from traditional time shifted and live TV. And that's because there's a lot of similarities in terms of the viewing experience in certain regards. Certainly, when we think about where connected TV is being accessed, it oftentimes is that large and primary screen oftentimes in a social area in the household, like a living room. So it's very conducive for co-viewing for a singular household. The viewing experience in a lot of regards is similar, but there's just more options in terms of and controls that are also afforded. So CTV is really uniquely positioned to kind of replace that live and time-shifted TV behavior, whereas there's a utility and rationale for watching video on your smartphone or your personal computer, but it's not as convenient or useful, especially when you're trying to share that viewing experience with somebody else. Now, kind of closing the loop on that concept of cord cutting, we did some research of our own last year to understand the landscape and perceptions related to CTV and traditional pay TV. And one of the things that we found that was particularly interesting was when we asked consumers whether or not they were intending to cut the cord, whether that be with satellite or with cable, there was a pronounced increase in the percentage of people that were willing or planning to do that if they'd already had a level of access and experience with streaming media services, ad-supported or subscription-based. So people are already thinking about making that shift, and being able to essentially sample in the convenience of their own household and switch really seamlessly between the two only further exacerbates that trend. And one thing that we think contributes here, we touched a little bit before, kind of at the end of that last call with Jason and Gabby, about pricing and how we're rushing back towards the expensive cable model. But cable companies especially had done a great disservice, I think, to their own brand equity over the years, because not only were they costly, but those costs tended to creep up unannounced on consumers, and we oftentimes found ourselves renegotiating our bills. So there is a lot of baggage attached to those services, whereas CTV services are still relatively new. They're kind of the new kid on the block, and they haven't had that kind of negative connotation associated with them. The costs are distributed sometimes across various services, so it doesn't seem like you're getting that big bill at the end of every month. And there's so much diversity in terms of what's available. When we actually polled our panel, we found that nearly 90% of our panelists felt either favorably or very favorably about CTV services, and kind of rounding out that 100%. Most of the rest of the responses were just neutral. Very few people had any kind of a negative opinion of CTV services. Now, thinking about kind of that diversity and how people are starting to access CTV, there's a couple of different inroads. And just in rank order, I guess, from the largest to the smallest. The biggest first in that bottom right corner highlighted in yellow are streaming media players. So those are Apple TVs, Chromecasts, Fire Sticks. There's a great variety of those services that people are using. There's a lot of benefit here. The general cost of buying these is relatively low, so pretty equitable for both high household incomes and low household incomes. They're fairly small and unobtrusive, so easy to kind of tuck away in your media console or behind your television. And they've kind of become the new stocking stuffers. So we're finding not only are many households having a streaming media player in them, but oftentimes I think over 60% of people that have a streaming media player actually have more than one available in their household. Moving from there to the next biggest are smart TVs. Smart TVs had an amazing year last year in 2020, as we were all very homebound. We were reevaluating the setup of our households and putting more money into home investment. That included upgrading our technology. So we actually saw the number of smart TVs in the US market jump by nearly 20 million since we last updated this particular number. So a really significant year for people to shift into this more advanced TV market and provide a degree of accessibility in terms of accessing smart TVs and CTV and OTT content. After smart TVs, we have gaming consoles. Easy to overlook gaming consoles because they are, as their name suggests, primarily focused on gaming. But in reality, that's not where the majority of time on gaming consoles is spent. It's pretty evenly split between gaming and streaming video. There's a very set of the population that is familiar and uses their gaming consoles frequently. They get very comfortable in those user interfaces, and so they oftentimes just segue from one action to the other without switching devices. And then last but not forgotten are Blu-ray players, kind of the original device that connected the internet to the TV. Every time we revise these numbers, we do see that number drop ever so slightly, but still very significant. Many US consumers still using them, nearly 25 million, certainly nothing for us to overlook. Now, when we think about how Tremor in particular plays in this space, what we have seen are a lot of smaller segments of that overall diversity of connected devices trying to build kind of their own entry point for advertisements. And we have seen some of our clients kind of investigate that space as well. It is somewhat myopic to kind of focus on just a singular TV manufacturer and their ad potential, or a singular streaming device group, because you are only getting a small segment of the total market. No singular TV manufacturer has really a commanding percentage of the market. I don't think anything that really exceeds 30%. So what Tremor brings to play is really kind of a broad and aggregate view of all these different inroads, which makes sure that all of our clients are serviced appropriately and can find consumers no matter where they are connecting to the CTV world. It allows us to capture nearly 95% of US CTV households. So just a kind of winning strategy in terms of making sure that you're not leaving any of your target audience unengaged. Now, one of the things that, one of the charts I find to be most interesting and indicative of what transpired in 2020 with COVID is these numbers that we're looking at from eMarketer. So eMarketer is obviously well known and famous for their projections at the beginning of the year across the entire media landscape. And at the beginning of 2020, they projected the OTT subscriber universe in the US, represented by the blue line in this chart. When COVID occurred and we started to go into quarantine and lockdown and various types of self-isolation, eMarketer, along with many other reputable sources, acknowledged the fact that they expected CTV and OTT activity to increase, but that it would be a temporary blip on the radar, essentially. But come kind of the end of Q2 or beginning of Q3 of 2020, eMarketer took the step of actually revising this projection and many other projections because obviously consumer behaviors and lifestyles had shifted so dramatically. And so that orange line represents that re-projection of the OTT subscriber universe. And you can see that it adjusted from 192 million up to 207 million, which is a number that they originally weren't expecting to hit until 2023. So a very significant step into the future and a trend line that carries on from there at a fairly similar level. So not, again, a market correction that we expect to see happen anytime soon. It's really much more of a long-term trend that will take years to play out. Now, in terms of what makes CTV so useful and unique to consumers, these are the 4 pillars we primarily focus on. First is extended reach. So as you remember that first slide I was showing you related to cord cutting, you can't really find all of your audience in one video platform or another. You need to really diversify and make sure that you're not, again, overlooking any of your target audience by focusing singularly on pay TV or singularly on CTV. There's a lot of complementary elements there and technologies that we can utilize to make sure that we are on CTV finding those consumers that are not accessible on the linear TV space. Better qualified audience speaks again to the fact that CTV is much more akin to a digital channel than a traditional broadcast channel. So we have much more granular data and understanding of who is viewing what, as opposed to relying on representative panels, which are kind of an antiquated approach at this stage in the game and also very limited in terms of their overall view of the entire market. After that, we have lower ad to content ratio, which has a real benefit for both consumers and for advertisers. From a consumer standpoint, fewer ads do have a benefit in their minds, especially in the US, where we are inundated with more advertising than really anybody else in the world. Whether conscious or subconsciously, people do recognize when they are being shown less advertising and getting back to that primary programming that much quicker. And from an advertiser's perspective, there's a big upside because those commercial pods are fewer and shorter. There's less competition, there's less noise, and we see that really pay off in a host of different brand KPIs that are beneficial for brand building. And then finally, the measurement capabilities, which again, were touched on in the last talk, are continuing to advance. And again, because of the granularity of data and the digital likeness of this channel, there's a lot more that we can provide back to our clients in terms of informing them of how their campaigns performed and a lot of the detail and opportunity to optimize appropriately. So just touching on, again, what I was alluding to in those last couple of pillars, there is a great benefit for brands in terms of utilizing CTV. So viewability first and foremost, which is obviously has become a very important metric for all of us over the years, doesn't have the same challenges within the CTV environment that we've seen on the digital channels. CTV is designed by its very nature to be highly viewable, and that does have a very important trickle-down effect in terms of driving other brand KPIs like ad and brand recall, which we see very elevated after CTV exposure, and then that drives consumers further down the funnel in terms of taking appropriate actions like purchasing and finding out more about a particular brand or product. And then the engagement rate is also very different because of the high level of viewability, the low ad to content ratio. And we are seeing, as Gabby alluded to in her discussion, more and more of our brands looking to figure out how to take this very passive channel, traditionally of TV, and make it more engaging or help usher those consumers in that journey through things like QR codes and similar technologies. So really making it a really seamless experience for consumers as opposed to them having to remember brands and then go searching for them. Now, one thing that we find interesting as we were talking a little bit about how this particular space is diversifying quickly, especially as it relates to subscriptions, is the fact that there are a lot of players here. For a long time, the burden was really on Netflix and Hulu to build up this new kind of format and kind of evangelize it to the marketplace. But now we have a lot of really big names coming out and contributing. So obviously Disney Plus made a massive splash only a little over a year ago, followed quickly by HBO Max and by Peacock. And if you've watched TV in the last month or a month and a half for the Super Bowl, you undoubtedly saw an advertisement for Paramount Plus. So we're getting a lot of different players in this space. But what we anticipate is that we don't expect the subscription video on demand space to really grow all that much more, even though we have all these new players. There's going to be more of a ground war between all of them competing for content and premium content. And so that's going to cause a certain degree of consumer confusion as people do want to chase their favorite shows or the content that they love. And they're not going to be as wed essentially to these specific services. They can basically move and pivot very quickly. And we obviously know that the cost does cause some issues as well. Even just building out a really simple rate card of a couple of on-demand and a couple of live streaming solutions still adds up to $60, which looks like a great savings, but people want to spend even less than that when they're thinking about CTV. So there is obviously going to be some sticker shock and eventual retraction in terms of the cost implications of CTV services. And we know that in our own polling, we've seen a lot of consumers say that when they are thinking about reducing the amount they spend on TV, the number one choice they're going to make is reducing the number of subscription services, even more so than canceling cable or canceling satellite. And a lot of people are figuring out how to make up for that loss of that content by looking at free and ad-supported services. And as those grow in terms of brand recognition and knowledge, we're going to see that become even more and more commonplace. And then quickly, one of the things that we think is going to be much more transformational, rather, about people coming into the CTV space, especially as they upgrade their technology, is this concept of free video on demand, where we're seeing more and more apps becoming readily available and not even requiring downloading for consumers. So they're right there and they kind of have at their fingertips a whole diversity of options when they're thinking about what they want to watch. And so a really quick exemplary video shows you how a consumer might go searching for a movie. Obviously, the cinema industry unfortunately fell off a cliff this year, so more and more people are watching movies from home. Look for the Terminator. They have a couple of different options. Some are free, some are rent to view. It's very easy for them to kind of make that quick social contract, understand that they'll sit through a couple of ads, very similar to trailers that we're all accustomed to in the movies, and then they're off to the races watching that content as opposed to pulling out their credit card or subscribing to any kind of additional cost. And one thing that we still see as kind of a misconception in the marketplace is that people are leaving pay TV and going to CTV because they're entirely ad averse. And while that does apply perhaps to some segment of the consumers, it's certainly in the minority. It obviously costs a premium to kind of avoid ads entirely, and not everybody is necessarily ad averse. Nearly 3/4 of the market is still watching ad-supported content or seeking that out. And 2020 also had an interesting effect there when people were really blazing through their subscription libraries and accumulating costs essentially as well. They were increasingly searching for free content and willing to, again, make that trade-off in terms of watching ads as opposed to paying additional money. And that has a real benefit for consumers as well. They understand that social contract. They're becoming more and more aware of how the targeting works to bring them more relevant ads that might resonate with them better. And so they have a much better opinion of these ads after they've kind of gone down that road of making that agreement. And finally, just thinking about 2020 and the impact that it had on consumers kind of sampling what was in the marketplace, we saw in our own research, and this was early in 2020 and back in July, that 35% of US consumers had tried a new ad-supported streaming service since the beginning of the COVID lockdown, and nearly 80% of them were actually intending to continue using that service. So a really unique moment in time for kind of sampling and testing out new services, which is going to result in long-term loyalty for consumers and help kind of guide them into some of these new venues and new video viewing options. So really great positive opinions of CTV that are similar to subscription services when we're thinking about ad services. So quality and variety of content, but also the quality and number of ads are something that consumers register and acknowledge. So a big benefit, not just for the viewing experience, but also for advertisers that want to invest in that particular space. And just a couple of additional stats again, relating to 2020 and the impact that had on some of our partners. So we saw the signups increasing dramatically for these different free services, as well as the amount of time spent. And then the terminology in some of the searches was also changing as time went on. Again, as people were kind of blazing through all of that paid for subscription service content, they were looking more and more for free movies and free video. So a real shift in terms of the consumer mindset when they're thinking about how to find and access different viewing programs. So that's a quick summary. We obviously are constantly maintaining kind of thought leadership piece, and that was only a small segment of what we have and bring back to our partners. So I hope you guys found that interesting. And if you ever do want to learn more, you can always reach out to myself and my colleagues at Tremor, and we can always set up a session with you and your teams or your clients and inform you about anything that's relevant and give you the stats you need to kind of make the right choices there.
All right, well, that was really awesome and insightful. I think, to your point, towards the end there, I think we're at that point in the saturation of streaming services, right? Where it's not about switching from cable or cutting the cord to streaming, but now you have to decide which streaming service I have to get. And it's like, oh, well, Disney's doing this and Paramount's doing that. Should I still be paying for that one, right? Which brings me to my point. Someone's got to bundle these together, cut all the prices down a little bit, and I'll sign up for them all, right? Like just make it a little, right? So which we know will happen sooner rather than later. But this is great, Terence. So thank you so much. It's a fascinating landscape. And as a consumer, it benefits us all because we get these great shows and certainly lots of opportunity for our industry as well. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Great, my pleasure.
All right. Well, we're going to keep the show rolling. We have two more amazing speakers. Our friend Megan Matlock, who's the AVP of Media at